So, hi everyone, welcome to Chaotic Stupid. I'm Kevin.
And I'm Nicola, and today we're going to be talking about character backgrounds from the standpoint of a dungeon master and a player, how to make them, what not to do, what to do, what are our favorites, and things like that.
Yeah, that's. I mean, it's a huge topic, right? And I'm pretty excited to talk about it, just because, like we discussed last time as well. Characters are such a central part of what we do, especially the way we like to play. Right, this whole narrative focus. I mean, sometimes we're not even playing D&D; it's more like we're doing improv. Sub 10 rolls per session sometimes over five
Yeah,
hours, which is crazy.
yeah.
Um, and in that, of course, you need to have a really good character background, but it also needs to be functional. So I think you and I probably have a lot of experience, very subjective experience, but very, very interesting on the topic. So, I think a great place to start is favorite characters, because we've both made so many. I mean,
Yeah.
can you even count how many you've made?
No, I think you've got the edge on me there for sure.
Yeah, but I'm crazy,
I,
so that doesn't count.
yeah. I think I've made a lot of PCs, which
Mm,
is definitely a different kind of experience, and have had to create characters on the fly sometimes and things. So yeah, it would be hard to count them because I've made up so many characters like in the middle of a session
oh yeah.
or in the middle of a conversation that you just forget about them afterwards. So
That's
yeah,
a really interesting topic actually. That maybe if we have time later on, we should also discuss like floating
yeah,
backgrounds.
yeah.
Character doesn't have to exist until you decide to assign the background to a certain character.
Yeah,
But
yeah, and those are very interesting choices. I think, yeah, if we have
yeah,
time, we definitely should. And just to clarify for folks, we would discuss favorite characters we've made, right? Just to make sure we're on the same page.
yeah.
So you want to start? Do you want me to start? Should we do one
Um,
one? Like, what do you want to do?
why don't you start first? I still am having trouble picking even now. Like
Yeah.
we discussed this just now for 45 minutes, and I still cannot decide which one I want to talk
Yeah.
about. So
Yeah.
you go first.
Um, all right. So I'll talk about a PC first, and it comes as no surprise to you. Or anybody who's heard me talk about our game before, but my favorite player character I've ever made is one Magnus Odegaard, the Baron of Gamegadder, Slayer of Giants and Dragons, and anything you would believe him
Mm,
if you give him enough time to talk to you.
yeah.
Um, yeah, it was the first time I made a character that I was connected to and to such an extent where I could almost feel the both of us growing at the same time in certain situations and
Right.
just yeah, it was a very unique character and very dear to my and close to my heart. We played it for a very long time, of course, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, I was very lucky, I think, to have that character to DM for. It was super fun just because, you know, in large part because of the backstory that you made, it kind of shaped a huge part of that campaign, right? But what
Yeah.
was it that you liked so much about him, right? Because there were so many facets to that character. Some came up later, some developed, and some were there from the start.
Uh, well, there's a couple of different things that I like the most from a background standpoint. What I really liked and what is maybe sometimes uncommon in certain D&D games is his family, right? Like I really liked that he had a mom and dad, a brother and a sister, and an actual, hearth to go back to. And this was his, if anything, this was his main driver in all things he did. Every decision he made, every risk he took, every leap of faith he took, it was all for the family, right?
Yeah,
And I think it resonates with me. I have a large family whom I love, so
yeah,
I definitely think it was inspired by it. Although my family's not noble and recently beset about upon by pirates and bankrupt and under the boot of a malevolent king, so some differences, you know
some small ones, right?
um small ones, but yeah, I think that as a narrative and a character kind of pillar or foundation, his family
Yeah,
is what I really like the most. And then just in general, the growth. What the Magnus from session 1 to Magnus from session 100 and something.
Yeah, I think we got to over 100.
Yeah, I remember we reached that mark. So
Yeah.
two different people, similar in certain regards, and there's that common theme throughout.
Yeah.
But definitely an entirely different type of person.
So in what way was he different? Like, you know, because I think I know, but of course I also observed it as a dungeon master, so that's probably different from what you experienced.
Well, I think a lot of maturity happened, a sort of coming to terms with his situation and destiny, and turning a kind of almost teenage kind of angst, which he should have grown out of anyway, into a driving force for his actions, right? He was angry and kind of bitter in a certain sense,
Right.
and then he turned that into passion and determination, and that really kind of is what I liked the most about the character growth.
Yeah. I mean, it was impressive. You know, we had, I think, the benefit and the pleasure of being able to play it out over, what was it, ultimately 3.5 years?
3.5, yeah.
Yeah. With a huge hiatus in the middle, but yeah, it was crazy. And, you know, for me, the thing that's always stuck with me was the way that character influenced the world from the beginning. Like we talked about in the last episode, but, you know, from a world building perspective, there wasn't that much when we started, and you were you basically told me, you know, he's a noble and his family's fallen on hard times, and out of that and the culture that you chosen for him grew an entire kingdom.
Yeah,
you know?
He hated pirates. That was also like
yes,
that was
he hated pirates.
He hates pirates. Just hates them.
Yeah. No, that was super interesting, you know, and I think it's an extremely good example of also, you know, how DM and players kind of work together and complement each other, because without you, and, you know, I still incorporate that idea of having a family in your character background into most of the characters I make now. Like, it's actually such a fundamental point, and it's so easily dismissed because it's so much easier to not have a family.
Yeah.
Even for NPCs, you know, like, you don't necessarily think about their family right away, but if they have it, it's actually very relevant.
Yeah, it opens up so many doors and changes the perspective of the character in many potential ways, right?
Yeah.
So what about you? What was the favorite PC you created?
Favorite PC. So I'm stuck between two, which is Watcher, which we played recently in your one shot, and also from your one shot. So I think we see a common theme here. But Theodosius Dukas, I believe his name was. So Theo, I think I'll have to go with Theo still, but also partially because of having had a little more time with him.
Yeah.
But I just loved his background because I got to, you know, I also noble background, funnily enough. But in a very different way, right? Because he ran away from his family, and he was the kind of adopted son. I mean, he was his father's son, but by a different woman than his father's wife. And then, interestingly enough, it was his father's wife who took kindlier to him than his father. So all of these things, you know, like, when we came up with the idea of running the one shot, and I asked you about this, I just immediately had this idea of this disenfranchised lone wolf, not person, but like definitely away from his family, but still so heavily connected to them, right? And always putting on this sheen, because I think I definitely, you know, prefer characters that that kind of put up a veneer, you know, that are not themselves in their daily lives, where you can have this discovery as you play of who they really are. And I'm actually quite sad that we never got further with Theo, but, you know, his birth mother was actually in the city, of course, that we were playing in at the time, and he was finding out about that during the one shots. And, you know, the way that I mean, huge credit to you for incorporating all those aspects of a background for a character that was, for all intents and purposes, a throwaway character.
Yeah.
But I mean, I came to you, I think, with a 3-page background.
You did, and that blew me out of the water so freaking hard that I think I flew to Jupiter and back, because I remember reading the background being like, oh my God, I have to rewrite so much now just because I love this so much, and I need to make this guy's story a part of the
Yeah.
overarching plot. Like I just have to do it. And part of the second one shot that was sort of like a two shot, I guess we ended up running.
Yeah. Yeah.
We explored his backstory a little bit, right? And
Yeah.
and got him to do some RPing and stuff. And it was just like such a moment where I was like, ah, man, it's so nice for somebody to invest their time and energy into creating such a backstory for, as you said, like a throwaway character.
Yeah.
I was like, I gotta reward this.
Yeah.
I gotta make this meaningful.
Yeah. Yeah, no, exactly. And, I loved making it, but it was definitely a thing where I don't think that's the norm, even for me. It was just like the spark of inspiration hit. And it was,
Yeah.
that character just came to life for me from day one. And that actually made writing it down a little harder because
Yeah.
I had already figured out so much. It felt tedious to have to write it down because my mind
Yeah.
was just
Yeah.
racing. But yeah, I definitely like Theo was so much fun just because of the many different forces in his background that were still pulling at him, right? Even though
Yeah.
his birth mother he hadn't seen since he was born. His father was an absentee father figure for all intents and purposes, but still had high expectations of him. And then on top of that, he had this strange relationship, right? Because that was another kind of subversion of expectation. Please don't have the Game of Thrones flashbacks, but it was a subversion of expectation in the sense that he was actually super friendly with the woman that, in your traditional drama story, the stepmother hates the child that's not
Yes.
hers and things like that.
Yes.
But then we wove in, the also relationship with his siblings, and it created such an interesting character from the get-go. Like
Yeah.
I not once did I have to think about how he would act or what he would be like, because it was all informed immediately, because I knew that he had experienced this and he experienced that, and he was guarded in this way and open in that way, and
Yeah.
it was super interesting to play.
Yeah, and it very much showed, and I still remember like when you sent it to me and I read that part, I was just like, ah, that's such a nice spin. Like it wasn't necessarily like a eureka moment where you're like, oh my,
Yeah,
this is
yeah,
such a new. It just was such a nice, like you turned the whole trope on its head, and we're
yeah,
like, yeah, it fits so nicely, and you could clearly see it when you played him. Like it showed in the character, and I think that's the power of creating such a backstory, right? Where
yeah,
these are they're these like, I like to think of them as drives, right? There's this drive to either find his birth mother or take care of his stepmother, or get back as his whatever that drive is. As soon as you have that, that rock
yeah,
that just says, in this complicated, morally ambiguous, or in some other way, interesting situation, my character's first instinct is this.
yeah.
And you know it because you have the drive, and you can always say, well, he'd first think about this, so he'll respond like this, right?
Yeah, yeah. No, absolutely. And I mean, I think that's a really interesting, kind of a way to segue into also why character backgrounds can be so important. Because obviously,
Yeah.
I think it's probably important to acknowledge there's a bit of a stigma around backgrounds, in the sense that, for example, you probably like we've been talking about Twitter as well, and I kind of got involved in some of the community there, and
Yeah.
even there, they're super wonderful and accepting people, but when it comes to character backgrounds, the first thing you still hear is, don't make it 6 pages, or don't demand 6 pages. And it's like, I definitely feel like there's this kind of pressure on people to have super extensive and incredibly intricate character backgrounds, which is so not the point, not even with what we had with Theo or with Magnus, who eventually evolved to have these kinds of backgrounds, or in Theo's case had it right away. But it's not necessary. It's really nice to have when you have it, and build up to it, or don't, take as much as you need, but informing your character's actions in a way where later on you can say he acted like this because of that, and this is how that connects, and that makes room for growth as well, because your character can at some point choose to act differently than they have in the past, and that breaks with their character, but is actually part of their growth forward as well.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And like I was thinking about this, like, is there a sweet spot? Is there like this golden zone where if you hit this many characters or this many sentences or this many beats, like, will that character background be perfect? And I don't think that it would,
Yeah,
because I don't think that there's a too much or too little necessarily, right?
yeah,
And I will say that with like a slight caveat, because I think that you can do too much, but
yeah,
in a very specific way, and we'll get to it later on. But
sure.
I when I create a background, I like to think of it as like a telegram more than a letter, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because in a letter you have to you can be as elaborate as you want. Like you can fit as many sheets of paper in an envelope as that envelope will hold, right?
Yeah,
With a telegram, those of us who still remember what those things were, um, you have to be succinct, and you have to do like those sentences that are just like they pump, they give you as much information as possible.
yeah.
When I create a background, I try to do that. Like I try not to go into events. I go into um
Maybe experiences you can call them.
experiences. Yes,
Yeah,
that's a good term. I was thinking happenings, but I was like, that's pretty much the same as events. Yeah, experiences, right? Because
yeah,
to me, your family falling on hard times is an experience. You
mm-hmm.
detailing that your family was first beset by pirates and that they fought an attrition battle that ended up draining their coffers, and due to some internal struggles and subterfuge and idle noble games, they ended up losing support in court, which then like all of a sudden you're like, I'm restricting it so much.
Yeah,
When if I say they fell on hard times and there were pirates involved, you
yeah,
as a DM could be like, I see.
yeah.
So these were celestial pirates, or these were demonic pirates, or just a crazy pirate queen, you
Yeah,
know,
yeah.
whichever.
True, true, true. So I mean, it's really interesting, right? And I think it kind of raises the question of because throughout all that, right, you have all this information that you can potentially provide, but where do
Mm.
you even start? I mean, I think that's it's a kind of a crucial topic, and it doesn't even really matter about whether you're talking about NPCs or PCs,
Mm-hmm.
because every character, you have to start somewhere, and I don't know, like, where do you start? When you're thinking about your character background.
It's a good question. With Magnus, for example, I literally started with the character background from the PHB. Like I was like,
Right.
what? Well, not exactly. I kind of build it out from a few different ways. I kind of try to create my background through the character creation process, in a
Right.
way. So I had decided that I wanted to play a battle master fighter, right? That
Mm-hmm.
was a class that I fell in love with, and I was like, I gotta play this. Like it's a fighter that's also kind of like technically has spells. They're
Yeah.
physical, but they. So I was like, I need to create this guy, right? And from there, I started looking at like, okay, so what type of background do I want for this guy? And I was like, I never played a noble, and that sounds like fun, but just being a noble is boring to me. Like
Yeah.
I don't feel like I want to be that pompous,
Mm-hmm.
always looking at people from a higher horse noble. I want this noble to be interesting. So what's interesting about a noble? It's a disenfranchised or poor
Mm.
noble, right? A
Yeah.
noble who's fallen on hard times. Okay. So if he's fallen on hard times, why was that? Well, his family was hurt by the pirates. They lost their wealth. Now he's out in the world adventuring, trying to earn gold to send back to his family. Oh, okay. How does he do that? Well, he probably has to get his hands dirty, right? Because just
Mm.
purely adventuring, he was a young lad, couldn't really do it. So he had a criminal element to him.
Yeah.
And that was the building blocks. And I know that for a certain, in a certain sense, starting from the class might not be the most intuitive way to do it,
I
but
mean,
for me, it makes a lot of sense.
yeah. I mean, honestly, class or any other starting elements, whatever works is good enough, right?
Yeah,
I
yeah,
personally, for example, I can't start from class most times. Like
yeah.
there are a few exceptions. For example, if we're talking about D&D, you have your warlock or your wizard. in those cases, I think the class is more, or like a ranger as well, the class is more influential than your fighter or your rogue or your bard, who can be more, they can be more unaffiliated in their background and their class. But we've spoken a little bit about this, and one of the things that that I really like to do is focus on the central conflict, and I think you kind of did the same in that building block story. Is at some point you definitely come to the central conflict, that your character is pursuing, and for me, I just kind of like to start there right away, because I read quite a bit, and I watch a lot of television and movies, and the characters with the most interesting central conflicts are the ones that stay with you, right? I mean, I'm thinking, for example, of Marvel's Tony Stark and Captain America in this case, since we're there anyway, but also just in any movie, the character with that central conflict that you care about is the one that kind of stands out. And so for me, I want to care about my character because I'll stick with them. And so coming up with a central conflict is for me usually the part where it starts, and then I kind of go down the same route as you did. I start asking myself, okay, let's say with Theo, his central conflict was, I think, if I remember correctly, was finding his mother, his birth mother. Yeah. Right? Yeah. And as a secondary to that was also his conflict with his father, obviously. But from there, you kind of go and extrapolate, okay, so if his conflict is that he doesn't know his birth mother, then obviously what happened to cause that situation? Because when I first came up with it, I didn't even know he was noble. But then obviously from not knowing his mother and wanting to find her, I went, okay, so he's probably with his father, if there's a family alive, and his father would have taken him away. So what kind of person is in a position... Exactly, and maybe it's motivated by a desire for a certain social standing. So that's how you got to noble. And it kind of builds up from there. And I think, having that approach of extrapolating from the few things that you decide, and whether that's just picking a background from the PHB or using your bonds and flaws, and still talking about D&D, but other systems have incredible inputs as well that you can just take as your starting block, and you just build your background on top of that. And it doesn't all have to be done when you start playing the character, because even as you play the character, you can discover things where you're like, in the middle of a gaming session, you might be going, oh, this would be super interesting for my character to have as a background, so I'm just going to play as if he has that, and after the session I'll put it to the dungeon master and say, hey, I've just added this, maybe you want to play with that as well.
It sounds like when I thought, hey, it would be cool if Magnus had this love interest that was lost to him because of all of the struggles, and I think I came up with it in like the spur of the moment, where our characters were sitting on the cliff on the like overlooking the sea, and there was a stone, and I was like,
oh yeah,
and I had the character point to something, and it was just like a heart with two initials, and that I just said like, it was Ida and Magnus, and that you turned that into a huge story beat many months later, right? And it just came out of relatively speaking, out of nowhere, right? But I see where you're coming from. That central conflict is very important, I think, as well. Even though I don't always start with it, I do always get to it.
I think it's just like you either build up to it or you can start with it. I think starting with it is probably more difficult. Unless you're someone who, because what I do is I don't start with it, as in I come up with it myself. I steal the ones that I like best in popular fiction, and I go, that's
we
all
do that. Who doesn't do that, right? Like, to an extent, we all do it. Like, it's just because you love that so much and you want to give your own interpretation, or you want to embody that for the briefest of moments every week or every other week, right? Be that person.
Definitely.
It was interesting because I think I came to the central conflict like step 3, because I was like, okay, family, they're nobles, they fall on hard times, and then his central conflict became, I will do anything to restore my family's glory, and that was where everything else started, right? And with JJ, which those of you who watch the sessions we have, Jean-Jacques Dupois, there I started with the central conflict because I was thinking deeply about what type of character I want to play. I was like, I want to play a character that again has a strong bond with the family,
Mm-hmm.
but I want to do it in a drastically different way because I want to explore that part. And I was like, ah, this is a gold mine. Now
Yeah.
this can be interesting. And that's where I came up with the whole idea of him being like so like a tool, you know.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, that's also interesting that you bring up Jean-Jacques versus Magnus, because if you look at the two characters, technically, and I don't think that's the case now, but he definitely seems to have started as a
Yeah.
subversion of Magnus, right? And that's another great way to start your characters, especially, and I think maybe I'll segue here to NPCs.
Yes.
You know, because when you're dungeon master, you have to come up with a lot of a lot of characters. Then at some point you run out of brain space, right?
Yep.
Especially if you are like me and you've decided to let your characters in on the biggest party in the nation, which has like 600 people attending. Dungeon
Good luck,
Masters,
by the way.
yeah, don't make that mistake if you're new. But yeah, even smaller parties or assemblies or places, especially if your player characters are in a city, they'll encounter a lot of different NPCs, and keeping those both straight and unique is difficult, right? And I think subverting older characters is definitely an interesting way to do it, because you don't have to like mirror a character fully to make something else unique. You can just take like one aspect of another NPC or a PC that you've made, and reflect that here. So for example, with what I would do is with Theo, I would just take him, but you know, maybe he has a much better relationship with his father, or maybe, you know, an abusive but productive one, and make that a character, and suddenly it's a unique character, even though you know you have this whole background that you could attach to it. It's also not super relevant all the time, because of course your NPCs, for their background to be super relevant outside of the immediate interaction with your player characters, your players have to take an interest, and that doesn't always happen, and in fact most often it doesn't happen. But it can still be nice to have kind of this base layer of understanding of who this NPC is, so that you can inform their action and their choices as well.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, like, I get what you're saying with, you know, it requires the players to interact and kind of want to discover it for it to really come out. But I also think that in certain ways that hidden background, like what they don't discover, is sometimes even more powerful.
Yeah, definitely.
Because it moves things around so much, and if they don't know or if they don't inquire, they get to see the result, and they get surprised, and they get, like, you know, elated with fighting things out, and I think that's very interesting thing to do. But I agree with, like, I when I first started DMing, I really thought for a long while, like, I'm so crazy and I'm so stupid. Why am I thinking so far deep into this character's history? It's an NPC, and I know they won't get into it so much. Like, what is the purpose of this? But I constantly felt the need to. Like, I constantly felt like I need to flesh this character out more. I need to know more about them, because I wanted to play them better, right? I wanted to act better.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, I think I don't want to call it a pitfall, because it's not a bad thing to have happen per se, but you can get stuck in it, right?
Yes.
And I think for creating NPCs especially, it's just keeping it functional most of all. I think is where it's at. You know, you still can decide their central conflict, but they can be really simple, right? Like this character, and one way that I formulated it for myself a few weeks back, and I'm sure I'm not the first one to do this, is to say, for example, for NPCs, what I'm going to do is I'm going to decide their current goals.
Yeah.
And one secret. They just have one secret that's like key to them, right? And from there, we'll see what happens. Because how else am I going to organize 50 plus NPCs for our ball? I need to have a structure that I can understand each time, and make sure that those characters still remain interesting when I need to pick them up. So yeah.
Yeah, that's a good way of thinking about it. I don't think I've done a similar thing where I did I guess a binary character background,
Yeah.
if I can call it that, which was one was very similar. It was a goal, what they want. I just called it what they want, right?
Yeah,
So what do they want out of the situation, or what do they want in general? Like what is their goal? What do they want to achieve? And the other was like their motivation for that, which also helped me because like if they want to kill the queen, and then I just ask myself why, and that's because the queen is anathema to their system of beliefs. And then I already placed them in a particular system of beliefs or an organization or a country or a clan, whatever it is. And that can be explained away easily, and I can build upon it with some improv if I need to.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I think, PC or NPC, I think starting small is the best way anyway. You know, you just need to know what your character is kind of about. Just as long as you feel confident that you can portray this character, you're good, because the rest you can fill in. And I think this is probably the next thing that I would say always is literally build on your backgrounds. Like, you don't have to have it ready, and I don't think any DM should demand that it be ready completely before any game, because a background, like, imagine how much it is, right? Even for us, I mean, I'm 27 years old, and let's say that my background covers where I'm born and my teenage years, roughly.
Yeah.
And then maybe something that happened in the last 2 years that still covers less than, let's say, 10% of my life.
Yeah.
So during the sessions, and like being able to, as a dungeon master or as a player, to add on to your background and say, okay, hey, this thing I just came up with, and it would be super cool if this happened in my background, because it's going to be relevant somehow, or it makes my character more interesting. That is where you really, I think, make your wins and your gains as you develop your character.
Yeah. I wholeheartedly agree, and I don't think that's necessarily a surprise, having said that my favorite thing about Magnus was character growth. I think the most important thing for me when I make a character background is that it's informative enough that I have the drive that I talked about earlier, that I know like what drives this character forward. Why do they get up in the morning?
Yeah.
But it's also open enough that I can keep adding things to it without either significantly altering the drive or even altering it because of the things that have happened. I think that for me, the most rewarding thing about playing Magnus and his character growth is how I could learn from the world that you created, and how you took an active part in my character's background. And this is like a moment where I'd like to, what I absolutely love is when a DM does that. Like, I feel like the game of Dungeons and Dragons or any tabletop RPG, the beauty of it is that it's like, sitting around a fire in camp and talking with your friends, and you're all lying your asses off about how you jumped from a 3rd-story building onto a pile of clothes and survived, and then the other guy tells another story and the girl tells another story, right? It's the storytelling, and you all participate in, and everybody is adding to the experience. And for me, that relationship between dungeon master and player, or even other players, is what makes the game truly rewarding, and what makes my characters truly rewarding. Like, having you jump in there and say, like, hey, you remember that love interest you mentioned a while back? Well, turns out super important. And I'm like, that's so cool, because in an instant, that in me evokes so many strong feelings. It's like, there's jealousy, there's anger, there's hatred. All of a sudden, I'm thinking back to all of the situations that they two had. Never crossed my mind before. Never knew that those things happened. But at that moment, I remembered them all.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's the fun part, because what I never realized at the time, but what I have come to realize since is, and I've alluded to this many times to many different players and dungeon masters, is this great idea that someone posted on Reddit a while ago called the knife theory, right? So just to kind of clarify for people who've never heard of it before, the knife theory is essentially the idea that if you take part in any tabletop role-playing game, You know, you always have a dungeon master or a game master and the players. And the players essentially create their characters, but if you want to care about your characters have to care about things in the world that they live in. And essentially everything that your character cares about in the world that they live in is a knife that your game master or dungeon master gets to stab your character with, right? Because if your character has parents, your parents can get abducted. If your character has a sister, maybe that sister hates him and tries to kill him. Or, you know, and that's just family, but there's also things like bonds and oaths and all that stuff, you know, everything can be a knife. You don't have to have 100 knives for an interesting character, but you can just have, you know, at least a few really good ones and build on that together, right? And that's, I think, also exemplifies the whole dungeon master, game master, and player relationship in how you negotiate that, because it's never just from one side. You kind of do it together. But when you do it right, you know, you have a couple of beautiful knives that you can stab really well with.
And twist, because that's what you do, you bastard. You twist as well.
I
it's
don't
not
know what
just
you're
stabbing.
talking about. I've never twisted a knife in my life.
Yeah. No, I think that, like, it's a testament to how well this works when I can say and remember clearly situations where I wept. I didn't cry, I wept because of a knife that was thrown at me. Like, and it was not even a real knife, so to say, right? It was a fictional situation within a fictional world. It was not just a fictional world. It was a dream.
Yeah, dream within a dream.
Dream within a dream, right? And it was just so painful and so heart-wrenching and beautiful at the same time.
Yeah.
And that's what happens when you allow your fellow players and the dungeon master into your story.
Yeah, definitely.
And that's why I think it's important to balance it out. And another thing that I like to do is, like, I like to learn about the world first, as much as the DM is capable and willing to share at that point. Like, you know, you send us a brief for this latest campaign containing a lot of information about the history and, like, some of the factions and nations. And I was like, I can latch onto this. This immediately is like, oh, border town up top, fighting evil things and hardy people and, you know, tough living and all they were, you know, it really wakes up all of these you know, or stirs all of these creative juices, allow you to build out a character background in a more informed way. Because I personally don't like being not even the black sheep, but the alien in the barn, right? Like, where I'm just like, oh, I created a gunslinger that uses lasers from his eyes, and we're in a low magic setting. Whoopsie. You know, I enjoy being integrated into the world because I want to feel like a person in that world. That's where I get lost.
Yeah, definitely. And honestly, that kind of brings me to actually 2 points, but I'll start with one. One, which is that I think when people think about, especially, let's say, newer players, or not even newer players, but just anyone who isn't super comfortable creating character backgrounds, right? Because I think we have to acknowledge that you and I are both super comfortable with it, you know, not necessarily the struggling type on that front, whereas we struggle on other parts. But, you know, I have had experience, you know, some of our other fellow players from the previous campaign and even currently are not super into the whole building their characters up. And I think from that front, one of the things that pressures people, in my opinion anyway, is the need to be unique as well. And I think that's something that definitely to strive for you to feel that your character is unique enough, but don't underestimate how unique you can be by fitting in. Because that's what I like to do. Like, my characters are probably a little to the extreme in that front, but, you know, I will make as mundane a character as possible. Like, there's nothing super special about them. They just have a bit of emotional trauma, and they go to bed too late at night. Which is probably just me as a person. But
I didn't want to say it, but you said it.
Yeah, it's there. But, you know, like, super kind of Joe average for a superhero, obviously, because we are talking about typically characters that have additional powers or abilities, but even then, you know, like, fitting in and being mundane and then finding that little niche to twist to what you like, because it takes away so much pressure from creating your background, right? Because you can make a very standard background of, okay, XYZ, this was his life, and that's where we're at. But there's this one thing that just worked a little differently, you know, because with Theo, for example, you could still say that his background was fairly traditional, you know, like in terms of how that story goes, and that's why he added in the mom. She was different. And I think that that's a really fun way to take away the pressure and still find a way for you to feel like you're doing something that's different and new and not typically done by other players.
Yeah, I agree entirely, because what being common or being regular allows you to do as well is break out of the mold.
Yeah.
Like, what makes you unique is your ability to say, I was regular.
Yeah.
And now I'm no longer regular because I've achieved something, or I've changed in some way. And even if that's a kernel within the backstory that you build on during the game and expand on it, it's still sufficient for you to at the end be like, this character is just is awesome. They're different. They're me. They're my character.
Yeah.
And they're not like any of these other people, which I was very similar to at the beginning.
Yeah, exactly. And, you know, discovering that thing that makes you unique, I mean, that's something we do as people, and why wouldn't characters do the same thing? But also, I just realized another thing, that kind of, if you allow yourself to take away the pressure of needing to be super unique, I think you'll also quickly find it easier to not necessarily need, for example, a tragic backstory, which is, I think, you know, one of the jokes that runs through the D&D community is the most dangerous job in a fantasy world is to be an adventurous parent.
Yeah.
And it's true, right? Because they die.
Definitely.
All the time.
Definitely. Yeah.
Character turns 18.
Slaughtered by the millions.
Yeah. Character turns 18, picks up adventuring. Oh, you're dead. Congratulations. That's it.
Yeah.
I mean, you just don't stand a chance, but you don't need that tragic background as long as you can allow yourself to lean into being average and finding out what makes you unique that way.
Yeah. And I mean, you know, life is filled with tragedies, right? It balances it out with other things, but like, you can find many forms of tragedy throughout. Even sometimes it's more beneficial to the backstory if they're cumulative, right? If they're smaller tragedies that have built up to something, which could also be interesting. But I think that there is merit to choosing a tragic background if you're so inclined.
Absolutely, yeah, definitely.
But it's definitely a little bit more tropey, I guess, which is why it's such a meme, right?
It is, yeah. I mean, also, I think there's probably you'll be more comfortable with it if you actively choose it instead of defaulting to it, which I think a lot of people do. Because it's kind of an easy handhold to make sure that, because there are benefits to a tragic backstory. There is an obvious emotional conflict, there's an obvious trauma, there's an obvious way that your character might have developed, but if you choose it deliberately, it's probably more rewarding to play as well.
Yeah, I agree. So I just wanted to maybe like not circle back, but just kind of like try to extract something from this very riveting and fun conversation. But like, we've talked a lot about our own preferences and motivations, and about like why we do the things that we do. But I was wondering, like, are there like some concrete tips that you would give a person that's just writing their first backstory that are maybe a bit less philosophical, even though we're both people who like to philosophize?
Clearly,
but,
yes.
And I think that again, that has its place.
Yeah.
But I'm just wondering, like, if there are some, like, you know, practical tips, like do X, Y, and Z if you're making your first character ever. Well, either as a DM or as a player, really.
Yeah, I think for me it's probably more interesting to talk about it from a DM's perspective, just because as we've discussed, I don't do my PCs typically in a very traditional way. But from a DM's perspective, you know, I think first of all, don't underestimate the wealth of characters that your players provide you with. Simply in the sense of, if you support your players in developing their backgrounds, even, do something that I think one of the people tweeted at me, which was a super great idea, is if you have players that are not super comfortable writing or whatever, just get them to write 400 words and add in a couple people that are important in their background, and bam, you already have, if you have 4 players, you already have at least 8 characters, if they put 2 in their backgrounds each. And I think that's a really great starting point, because not only do you get to have characters right away, but you get to have characters that are connected to your players. And of course you don't, unless your players are playing in the hometown where they are all from, they won't all show up at the same time, but it's definitely a great handhold. And you can pick one that's interesting and go like, okay, this character is going to show up in the beginning and maybe act as a quest giver, which is what I did with you guys in the first campaign as well. Beyond that, very practically, developing your NPCs, I think, gosh, where to start? What I do is I think I typically decide the, again, central conflicts that I want the characters or the players to be facing. And that is immediately filled in with NPCs, because there are the people that they have to care about, there are the people that they have to fight, or monsters, but they're still characters. And there's obviously some random people that you might want to throw in as well. And to flesh those out, I think a name, pretty much just start with a name, because you don't need that much more. If you like, add a personality trait. If you need that kind of basis to make sure that you can role play them confidently, give them a character trait or two, stingy or scruffy or rowdy or angry. I mean, I've used all of those kind of cliches and then just roleplayed that character for one session where I had no idea about the rest of their background. I just knew that they were a kind of angry, gruffy person with this quest or this bit of information. And then depending on the player's reactions, I would either build them up more if, you guys were going back to them and it was going well, or I would let them just be kind of what they were. And if I happen to be inspired, I might add like, oh, they have this little thing that's happening on the side right now. But I don't even develop characters that don't attract the party's attention most of the time. Aside from super crucial characters to my plot, I think I would leave NPCs mostly underdeveloped almost until I see that the players actually respond to them.
Yeah, so is that like the barest minimum that you would do? Like, their name, maybe their looks, but that's not really background, right? But names can imply backgrounds, culturally speaking and stuff, right?
Yeah.
And then like their disposition, emotional state, how would you call that? Disposition, I guess. Them being angry or...
So, I mean, I would say even it's more just a defining trait, because some people are defined by the fact that they're usually angrier. I'm thinking of inflammatory personalities we shall not name, but there are also people who are defined by the fact that they're super neat or slobby, or people that are defined by the fact that they are always at the pub at 7 p.m. It's not a nice thing always, it's not a super interesting thing always, but it is just that little thing that ironically gives character to a character. And that's all you need to make an impression, because that's the only thing you're doing with NPCs the first time, most of the time, is you're just making an impression. So a name and a trait, that's what I would go with.
That's cool. How
about you?
I sometimes, when creating NPCs, I also add accents, because I love doing accents. So for me, it's also like helps me get into the mood, like if I'm doing a French or a Southern or a Russian accent, it always gets me into like a spirit of doing the character, and then I spin it, of course. But that also can be like a background element, depending on what world you're creating.
Actually, if I can just hop on that one, for people who are not comfortable with accents, such as me, I like to do accents still. I ruin them frequently. But even then, if you still want to make a character sound unique, a good way to do it also is the way that they choose their words, right? What I sometimes do is to kind of establish a character being unique, is I will either, have a phrase or a few words that they often repeat.
Mm-hmm.
And I will
Mm-hmm.
talk around those words or that phrase more frequently, because subconsciously it will
Yeah,
kind of,
that's very cool.
embed in your players' minds that that is
Mm-hmm.
who this character is, even though
Yeah.
there's no concrete
He's
thing
the
to hold
what up
on.
man guy.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. I mean,
Yeah. Yeah.
gosh, who did we do that with? I mean, technically with the Pirate Queen that you mentioned, I had her, it wasn't words, but it was definitely in the room. Everything around her was just built to exude power. So she
Yeah.
had a woman on her arm. She was in a lavish apartment. She had servants, even though she was a pirate, but she had servants, and
Yeah.
like everything just informed the fact that she was a menace
And the queen.
and a queen.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a really cool way of approaching it, right? Just making the setting such.
Yeah.
Um, when it comes to character creation, and we talked a little bit about this, so I'll go for the character side because
Yeah.
I wouldn't say I've created more characters than I have NPCs, but I've created more characters with substance and with forethought. Because I one thing that I love about NPCs is just improvising
Mm.
and having these bare bones, but then just building the backstory in the moment.
Yeah.
With characters, I like thinking about it a lot more, and I think in terms of tips, I would definitely say try to figure out one thing about the character that you're most excited about. Like if you're brand new to D&D, but you are excited to play, you've either heard your friends talk about it or they've never stopped about it and annoyed you to such an extent that you couldn't have possibly refused one more time, so you still went. Um, Try to figure out what is the most exciting thing about this. Uh, Whether that's a class you want to play, whether that's a weapon that
Yeah.
you want to wield, whether that's a personality that you have always wanted to try out but never had the bravery to just go out into the world and be a completely different person,
Yeah.
whether that's an accent or a hairstyle, even, right? Like whatever it is, try to figure out that one thing that excites you
Mm-hmm.
and start from there,
Yeah.
because that's, I think, what allows me most of the time to start a character background is like I figure out, oh, I'm most excited about playing a fighter battle master. Okay. Then I build from there. I'm
Yeah.
most excited about exploring the other side of familial ties and responsibility. All right. Now I go into this and I figure out what other elements will go into it. So I think that is something that I would definitely
Yeah.
recommend, just that one exciting thing.
Yeah. I mean, that's a super cool idea.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One thing,
Sorry. Go ahead.
no, I was just gonna say, if you're entirely new to D&D and you've got just absolutely no clue about the game, and for some reason your friends haven't told you, or you didn't want to know beforehand, one thing that I would recommend, and I don't, it might be a bit weird for some folks, but look at the pre-generated characters that come with the starter set, because they often will have just an example of like how a complete character looks like. And if you're so inclined, you could always play that. But if you're interested in building out your character background, if you look at those ideals, bonds, and there's one more, I feel like,
Flaws.
flaws. Yeah,
Yeah.
like ideals, bonds, and flaws that they have, or any form of snippet of information, even like their items and stuff, that can be like, oh, so he's a barbarian and he comes from a tribe, and it's all he cares about, and he shuns wealth, but he's also quite silly. Like that can be a spark that
Mm.
gets you excited about something, and then you go back to the first step of
Yeah.
this is what I'm excited.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, especially, since we're talking about completely new players, I have had the pleasure of DMing groups that were completely new. But it's difficult as well, I think, from a Dungeon Master perspective, because you know your world and you know
Yeah.
everything that your players can and cannot do. And I think I got really great advice the other day where someone told me, just let your players think completely outside of the box. Doesn't matter if your world doesn't have half angels, half lizard people. Just as an example,
Yeah. Yeah.
doesn't matter. Just let them, let a new player come up with whatever they want, as mundane or as crazy as you like, and then just cut that down to size so that it actually makes sense in your world. and compromise, but give reasons also to make sure that you can include as much as possible in
Yeah.
some fashion. And I thought that was a really cool idea because I definitely see what you mean. Like new players can struggle, or even more experienced players who are more comfortable with mechanics than they are with character creation, and just letting someone go completely like, okay, this is just who I am, and we're just going to fit that into the world somehow, can be a really productive way of doing that, I think.
Yes. Yes. I think that's, I loved it as soon as you mentioned it the first time, because I think that will show you what they're excited about and what they really want to do.
Yeah.
And even if lightsabers don't really fit into your world, there's always the, what's it called? The sword of light or
The
whatever
Sunblade,
item.
I think.
Sunblade,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Or, if they want to ride a tank, maybe not a tank, but, a
Yeah.
dwarven automaton that's been long lost and they can find it. Maybe they don't have it, but they can find it in the
Mm-hmm.
future. So it can inform you about like what they care about, and you can work with them to get to that point.
Yeah, definitely. I do think it's important for us to say that don't expect complexity, I suppose,
Yeah.
from players who are either not comfortable or newer. Um,
Yes.
it's a mistake I've made, I think, quite a bit.
And don't demand it
Yeah,
as
that
well.
that doesn't work unless you're already on,
Yeah.
like, unless everyone's agreed. We're gonna make this complex, even if you don't know what to do. We're gonna
Yeah.
get there, but that's the only way.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
otherwise, yeah, it doesn't work. And I mean, it comes down to communication, of course, which is
Yes.
thankfully the D&D community and TTRPG communities are jumping on board big time with the fact that people need to talk to the dungeon masters and vice versa, just to make sure that you're on board. But I think it's so easy because you see all the potential that their characters could have within a world, and like I said, I've made this mistake. I've demanded too much of my
Mm-hmm.
players, and they were kind enough to indulge where possible, but I think I almost turned one person off from playing altogether because they couldn't do what I wanted from them. And I wasn't
Mm-hmm.
demanding it, but I was constantly pushing, like, hey, why don't you add a little more? And it's just not where they were in their journey as a player, and it's maybe not where
Yeah.
they were ever going to be. And that's something that you definitely need to be cognizant of. Otherwise,
Yeah.
you kind of end up alienating people, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think even with a bare bones background that doesn't really hold a lot of information, the player can still bring a lot to the table.
Yeah.
RP wise or mechanically or in every possible way, they just bring it in a different
Yeah.
kind of way, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
let's be honest, we humans themselves are not all interesting. So even if you make
Not
a
to everyone.
character, not to everyone, yeah, not everybody is interesting to everybody,
Yeah.
right? So even if you make a character that is a little bit less interesting, so to say, right, it's not as a complex a character,
Yeah.
that just might be the way that you like it,
Yeah.
and
And
that's
that can
fine.
and that can also be played super interestingly.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
it's all about what you do with it in the end, which is
Yeah.
good advice in many cases.
Yeah.
And but yeah, I think it's ultimately first and foremost just make sure. And I guess we're kind of going backwards in terms of like campaign timeline with these
Mm-hmm.
tips, but
Yeah.
ultimately it's like before you even decide to play in a campaign, make sure that you understand the
Yes.
expectations, and that because it is okay for a dungeon master to have high expectations or low
Mm-hmm.
expectations. It's perfectly fine for a dungeon master to say everyone should come in with just a bare bones character and not to have too much background, or for a dungeon master to say have 10 pages ready by Monday, as long as you agreed upon it beforehand
Yes.
and know
Yes.
what you're in for.
Yeah, I mean, or a dungeon master to, we talked about it last time, but or a dungeon master to send you a list of questions long as your college tests at midterm, right?
I don't know
Where
what you're talking
that
about.
absolutely buys you, and you're like, oh my god, this is the best thing ever, and I'm so excited now. So yeah, and that kind of thing helps set
Mm,
expectations, because I think what I would like to share in terms of like as a dungeon master, because I was a new dungeon master at the time, what helped me help my players create a background that fits the world is making myself available to be a part of the process.
mm-hmm.
I had a conversation with each and every one of my players in my first campaign where I talked to them about their backgrounds and like what character do you want to play. Aha, okay, you want to play that class. Well, they were all fairly new to the system. So, these races go well with it, or these classes go well with that race you chose. And oh, okay, so you're interested in that type of thing. Well, you could hail from this place or that place or
Yeah.
any other place that's completely outside of this realm because it hadn't had the whole world built out at the time, right? And just making sure that you're there for them and that you talk it through and that you through this process of talking it over get to a point where you understand what each other wants. I think that's very valuable.
Yeah,
Because then you can have an even better game.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And the thing is, I think, some people are already actively advocating for this, but it still happens in far too many or far too few gaming groups, is just have not just even a session 0 where you make these agreements and things like that, but just sit down together and think out your backgrounds out loud, figure it out together. Because I think, and I guess this is kind of my central grievance of this episode, I suppose, is that there's this kind of stigma, or at least experience stigma from my side, and what I've seen people talk about is that improv is the very best way to go, and like anything that reduces your ability to improv is bad by default. I mean, I don't think that everybody thinks like that, but it's definitely a sentiment that's come up in some fashion and to some degree of strength over time. And I think that is absolutely a valid way to play. And like we've talked about, bare bones characters and NPCs especially can be extremely useful and extremely fun in what they become. But there's no bad thing about building out a background, and doing it together is so much fun. You just spend a couple hours, like you said, sitting around a campfire shooting shit with your friends until you come upon something that makes sense for everyone and that you all can enjoy in the long run as well. Because other players might have super fun ideas for you, and you might have fun ideas for them, and also how your characters intertwine or interact or have interacted in the past. So I think there's definitely like potential there. But looking at the time and what we still wanted to talk about is, and you've kind of touched upon this already, we both have, I think, character growth, right? And leaving room for that kind of character growth. Obviously, we've talked about how you can have your foundational background, which can be really small, and you just kind of build on that. But I know that you still had more to say on that topic, so what did you, how do you think you can build a character background that leaves room for this specifically?
Yeah, well, I mean, I did mention a couple of the most important things in my view, when it comes to building this type of character background, which is, just thinking of the experiences rather than events, I think is very, very important.
Yeah.
But perhaps the most important thing is the intention of doing so. Like if you want to do this, you need to be aware that certain parts of your story need to have gaps. And leaving those gaps is what will allow you to fill them out as you go along and write them as you go along. Because as you talked about, even if we did take like 2 hours now, both of us, to write all of our lives on a piece of paper, no matter how fast we type, we wouldn't be able to type everything out because you wouldn't remember everything, first of all. But then also it would take a lot more time to write everything out. But it also, you would probably write the experiences and then not the events, because you in order to write the event, you would need the exact same number of years, right?
And honestly, actually, on top of that, even if you don't write the full experience, but what you took away from it can also be, like I was scarred here, or I was damaged, or it's very negative ones, but you get my point, I think.
Yeah, definitely. And I think also when it comes to leaving gaps, I mean also like temporal gaps. Like describe one experience from childhood and then describe one experience from adolescence. Everything in between is fair game. And then from late adolescence, if they're whatever, right, 4 or 5 experiences that are spaced out
Mm-hmm.
I think it creates a lot of opportunity for you as a player. And
Yeah.
this is a bit of a like I thought about this over the weeks actually. Like what is the most important thing about character growth is openness
Mm-hmm.
of mind and of intention.
Yeah.
Just staying open to anything that happens at the table and being like, oh, this is a great opportunity. And I'm entirely open to it because I don't have this preconceived notion that there's only one way my character can go.
Yeah.
Because this thing that just now happened goes against what I had originally intended, but it's so cool, it's so interesting, and it's so impactful that there's no way my character would just chill out and, be like
Yeah.
fine with it. So now that informs where my character goes, and it's like essentially like going off of off the freeway on a country road and be like, I'll just see where this goes.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
So
so yeah,
I
being
think,
open-minded is a
yeah,
huge thing.
I think based on that, I have to ring the gong early on our too chaotic, too stupid, because I want to rant.
Okay.
Because one of the things that always bugs me so much, and it's nobody's fault, it's a natural thing to have happen, but it still drives me wild. And keep in mind, but for viewers, like I have a huge history in starting to learn about role playing and storytelling in online role playing games. So in World of Warcraft and Star Wars, the Old Republic, and things like that. And what those players always did is, and you probably know the meme, this is what my character would do.
Yeah.
And they've established this character background, and it's not a background, it's just a single hallway, and they can only walk down that hallway. And any time that there's a chance for a character to choose to act differently than they usually do, that door just remains locked on either side, and they just keep walking, and they just always do things the way that they want to. And too often it just becomes this excuse to act in an unpleasant way towards the party, towards the dungeon master, or towards the story in general. And I hate it. And it's so easy to avoid the moment that you realize that character growth is acting out of character. Right?
Yeah.
The definition of when your character grows is when they choose not to behave in the usually destructive way that they used to.
Yeah.
And it's a fact that some people miss so easily.
Yeah, I mean it's hard for me to like, fully embrace perhaps our original intent of the segment where I maybe can disagree or something because I loathe it with a passion. Like I absolutely hate it.
Yeah.
And it makes it just makes such a poor experience for everybody else at the table. It's like just play along. It's that kid that never wants to share their toys in kindergarten, or comes and takes other kids' toys or something. It's just like, dude, we're all just having fun. Come along and play.
Yeah.
Don't walk off into the sunset not looking at the horrifying explosion you've left in your wake.
Yeah.
Because you just don't want to be cool.
Yeah.
You're just not cool. Not cool.
Exactly. And I think probably part of the problem with that comes from players who deliberately abuse it. But I think the situation is so prevalent because a lot of people fall into it unknowingly, in the sense that I think that they genuinely do not realize that how character growth can work. And I kind of we're ranting here, so I'm going to go into alignment here, because alignment is the same damn trap. It's like it's a box that you place your character in, and you close the box and they can never get out of it. And then you have, because in older editions everything was so much more mechanical, and we're talking specifically D&D editions, but this can be for any system that uses alignment charts or moral meters or whatever you want to imagine. And the whole point of it is, in my opinion, what alignment does wrong in 5e, which is I'm very thankful it's technically optional, is that what it does wrong is it tries to describe a character But a morally complex and a personally complex character, regardless of background even, has the ability to act in so many ways.
Yeah.
And you know, I mean, I wake up in the morning and let's say I decide to eat something and I don't do my dishes and I leave it for someone else. I mean, that's kind of, you know, at least neutral or evil, but I would like to consider myself good. So that already doesn't align. So in my opinion, alignment should describe actions, and I think that you should consider your character in terms of the actions that they take as well, because they can act evil 9 times out of 10, but if the 10th time they act better, that is where the interesting part lies, and that's where your background grows and your character grows, and that's where you kind of develop it.
Yeah, that's why I make all of my characters neutral, either true neutral or chaotic or lawful neutral. They're just always neutral.
Yeah,
because I reckon that it's just not possible to fit most people into this mold that's you're either one way or you're another way, and there's no moving in between, or there's no gray areas, when in fact most people fit into a gray area most of the time, because sometimes you're a dick, sometimes you're not, and sometimes you're just meh. And that's just the way, I mean, that's just the way that it is, right? In a very elaborate way that I just put that.
That describes the complexity of life.
Yes, so I feel you on that one. It's definitely not something that I can get behind. However, I will say one thing, just to not to be the devil's advocate, because I do not want to advocate for that type of behavior in its essence.
Yeah.
But I think that there is something to be said about creating a character that brings a sort of combative or contentious atmosphere to the group, as long as it's done in a way that is tasteful and that the others are aware that this is going to be happening.
Yeah.
Right? I think it can be done, but it just has to be well thought out, where it's the, like, I will continue our segment by adding what I hate about, and it's sort of a spin-off on what you just said, is I think it's too chaotic and too stupid to create a character that just would not be there. They would not be there. There's no way your chaotic, evil paladin of Orcus would stick around with a bunch of goody two-shoes folks that are going around and saving people from burning houses just because he set the house on fire before. It makes no sense. Why are these people together? You have to have a reason to be together. And it just does not make sense that such a destructive character would be sticking around with folks that are going to try and solve great mysteries or whatever. If you want to play that type of character, get on the same page with everybody else and just go full murder hobo, raise cities, and, you know, have a blast while doing it. But don't integrate that type of character into a well-balanced group. It just makes no sense. Like, I guess it's more like you have to come to the table to play with others. Yeah. Like, if you want to play solo, play an RPG game. It's the same thing. You're doing the same thing.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, you know, that lack of compatibility, but even more than that, I think it's a lack of awareness of exactly that fact of not being aware of the fact that you have to play with other people. They have to like you being there. Otherwise, you're not going to have a good time. They're not going to have a good time. Well, you might have a good time at their expense.
Yes.
That's not really the point of playing a tabletop game together.
Exactly. Yeah. I'm not taking time out of my adulthood to come to a table and play with friends. Play with friends just for you to be like, haha, man, I'm gonna burn the village that we just saved because that's what my character would do. Bringing it back, it's like,
yeah, exactly.
All right.
And I think, you know, there's definitely a case to be made here that, because you read so many horror stories, especially now that we have all this online communication, you read so many horror stories, but the truth is, I attribute 70 to 80% of those to the dungeon master.
Oh yeah.
Because, and I think that's something that, you know, we've been talking from the perspective of, or from the assumption that your players will want to play something that works with others. But of course, there is a corrective function in you, Dungeon Master, in saying, okay, I have to make sure that my players are those people, because
Yeah.
if that fundamental criterion is not met, there's no point in proceeding until you can either convince the problem to change their mind, or, I'm sorry, but kick the problem. Because you're there to safeguard not only your own fun, but the fun of all the other people at the table.
Exactly.
Exactly.
And I do believe in that adage that is a part of our community: your fun is not wrong, right?
Yeah.
I think that if you want to play that type of game, that's perfectly fine. I've played those types of games where we just come together, get drunk, and just do stupid ass shit that makes no sense. Like, it's not a D&D campaign. It's a bunch of hairy ass dudes sitting around a table drinking beer and just going crazy and doing all kinds of weird shit because they got magic, right?
Yeah.
And it just, that can be fun. And I fully support that play style. Like, I love my narrative games, but you also know I'm a mechanical player, so I love my mechanical games, but I also like just fun, random, chaotic games. It can be enjoyable, but everybody has to be aware that this is what's going to happen. Because if you come to the table and you say like, oh yeah, this lawful good, to use alignment just for the sake of making it clear, campaign where we save the world sounds awesome, and then you come and be like, oh, actually, I'm totally against this, and I'm gonna, subterfuge and lying and misdirection to just thwart all of the plans of the party, because that's my character. I'm like,
oh god, do you remember our first party?
Yeah.
And the problem that we had, which was to explain to people listening, we started this campaign, and I like Nicolas said, I had a whole interview list of questions. I wanted to make sure that these players were on the same line as I was, and I thought I did. And then this guy comes in, and he's a bit weird. I just had this like little weird vibe, but it's fine. People are themselves, and it doesn't matter to me. So we created our characters, and everything was fine. Everyone was like coordinating on backgrounds, and we even established that you guys had just completed an adventure, and had some fun like memories from that. And in the first session, like, we start, and I look at his character sheet, and it says chaotic evil or lawful evil. I don't remember, but I think it was chaotic evil. And I actually had to just message him like, dude, you didn't mention it was chaotic evil. But that's kind of where the trouble began, because this guy had almost deliberately not communicated the fact that he wanted to play this. And the best part of it all was when I acquiesced and I tried to make it work. I asked him, okay, so what is your character trying to accomplish? And, what is kind of his motivations and background, so that I can incorporate this in the world, because this is, for me as a dungeon master, a super important thing to do, so that I can connect the sessions and the stories that we're going to be exploring to every character in the group. He told me I didn't need to know. And
right.
Let me tell you, there's not a way to play a tabletop role-playing game and genuinely keep your entire character backstory and even actions. That's the best part. He wanted to keep actions a secret from me. I decide if you've succeeded and what you've succeeded in. When you try something, you can't just unilaterally decide, I've acquired a boat. Like, no.
Yeah. I remember you telling me this. I was just so confused. I just couldn't wrap my head around it, because I was like,
it's still mind-blowing.
The background, I could kind of be like, if he said it in a different way, it was like, oh, I want to surprise you, like, gives you a hint or whatever.
Yeah.
I just did not get the part where actions are being hidden, because like,
how do you accomplish anything?
Like, are you just playing is it just like your mind space and you're playing a game there, which is I do that. Like, I'm it's just silly, and you get lost your imagination. You just sometimes play out whole scenarios from games in your mind, but I was very confused.
This was too chaotic and definitely too stupid.
Yeah. First session was player combat initiated by him, if I remember correctly.
We stuck around with him for way too long, actually. I think it was like 4 sessions in total, and I should have just kicked him after 1, but that happens sometimes. But I'm sure he found a game at some point, or DM'd it, or found people that enjoy it. I'm sure. And it's, it kind of
Not
just comes
us.
back down again to that fundamental concept of communicate,
Yeah.
which is ironically the one thing he didn't want to do,
Yeah.
which is
I mean, it's
baffling.
not ironic. It's not. That's exactly the problem, right?
It's baffling, but you make life a lot easier when you communicate, and
Yeah.
it requires a bit of trust that your dungeon master isn't going to screw you over. But I think if you can't trust your dungeon master not to do that, then don't play with them
Yeah.
either. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it all depends on how you see it, right?
Mm.
Screw you over in the sense of break your character and break your story and kind of just make a mess of it. Sure. But going back to your knife theory thing, like I wrote my latest backstory with a bandolier of knives in there because I'm just excited to see what the hell you do to my character. Because it's fun. It's
Mm.
fun. Like life is unexpected. The
Yeah.
the the story progression has to be unexpected as well. Like when you're reading a book, the worst thing that happens is you read it and halfway through the book you're like, "Oh, I know the ending."
Mm.
And then you read the rest of the book and it's exactly what it was, you know, what
Yeah.
you thought, and you're like, sometimes it's rewarding. I gotta say, sometimes I just enjoy it for the journey. But like, if I'm watching a TV show and all of the tropes are there, and it's just like the blandest writing ever, and like two scenes in, they're like, oh, so this guy dies, and
Yeah.
that's the killer, and
Yeah.
this
It's
is the
really
love
obvious
interest. That is,
sometimes.
you're like, you watch the whole episode, and you're like, oh, well, that was a complete waste of my time.
Yeah. Yeah. No, definitely. Oh gosh. But yeah, I mean, there are so many things still, I think, to talk about. Character backgrounds is a topic that never ends.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
but I think, it's definitely interesting to go through some basics. I just wanted to quickly touch on a few cool ideas that, we grabbed off of Twitter before we started.
yes,
For, just getting started on your character, or even helping, as a dungeon master, helping your players develop further. So I guess I'm continuing the tips section here. It's
hmm,
episode 2, guys. Just deal with it.
yeah,
Uh,
yeah. We're a mess. It's fine.
exactly. Hey, don't talk about me like that. No, I'm kidding. So one cool idea was 5 rumors. So and I'm obviously gonna try to put these up with like tweets and crediting the right people. But one of them suggested like 5 rumors where you have 2 positive rumors about your character, 2 negative rumors about your character, and like one that can be kind of, I think, in the middle, if I remember correctly,
Hmm.
which is cool. And I kind of like that structure, right? I mean, there are other
Yeah.
ways to do it as well. To have, for example, um, for people to just know one good thing about your character, one bad thing about your character, and one embarrassing or secret or something, depending on what you want to make of it. But kind of structuring it with these little tidbits, right? Like you said with the telegram as well. Just structure it really simply and give that information to the other players, and then you can really improv off each other if you don't have more
Hmm.
more decided than that, and that can be super fun as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's an excellent tip, I feel like, because it really allows you to kick things off nicely. I think
Yeah.
it's very cool.
Yeah. And one more that as a dungeon master really really resonated with me, and I think you'll appreciate it as well, is if your characters, and I think this will be actually probably the majority of people playing D&D, is they will start off with a pretty simple background, right? And
Yeah.
for newer players, maybe they don't start this building process as easily. So one thing you can do is in between sessions, you can just ask them to input one piece of information about their character. Either they come up with a secret, or a
Mm.
person that they know, or a thing that happened. Anything
Yeah.
that does add a building block to their background. And what he did was, when the players did that, so they could only do one per in between sessions, but when they
Hmm.
did that, they would get a little experience bonus the next time.
Ah,
So
nice.
when you play with experience, but I'm sure that you could adapt this to a milestone setting
Yeah.
as well if you wanted to, with some other kind of reward or maybe inspiration for the session.
Hmm.
Can be very nice, and it just rewards your players for thinking about it without pressuring them too much to add a lot, right? And I really
Yeah.
like that
Yeah.
kind of, because it naturally kind of emulates that 1, 2, 3 structure that we were talking
Yeah.
about.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's very cool idea. I would imagine you would stop at some point, right? Like
Yeah.
if you're 30 sessions, then you might stop just because
Yeah.
at that point you're kind of maybe doing too much to expand it, but I really, really like this
Yeah.
idea. Like, especially with a new group, not just necessarily new people, but new players, but a group that it hasn't played before with each other.
Hmm.
That's very cool,
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I
because
thought that was
when
a
you have
great
people who
idea.
played before together, they can more easily get into the groove.
Yeah.
But that's very cool.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And then finally, I just wanted to kind of touch on what we already mentioned a little bit. But having this adventure before the session, right? And I
Hmm.
actually kind of brings me back also to something else I wanted to mention, which is in a character background, no matter how much, whether you write one line or 15 pages, um, don't include, like, don't finish every event that has happened in there,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
Because if you have a character that's 40 years old and they got married when they were 18 and divorced when they were 27, and they raised a kid, and it's all behind them, at some point you're writing all this cool backstory that, while informing the character, is not relevant in the present day, outside of, maybe
Yeah.
that the child shows up or something. But if the emotional development of the events in your character's backstory is done, if the experience is complete, like truly complete, in my opinion, its value kind of plummets. Like, it's interesting to know. Don't feel bad
Yes.
about having it, but from a dungeon master perspective, I can't stab you in the back with something that's done and dusted and, doesn't have any relevance to you anymore.
See, he just wants to stab people in the back. That's all this really is. Like all of these tips, that's the purpose. Jeez.
Look, it's really fun, okay?
No, I'm kidding because as you were speaking, I was thinking like processing it and like that has you have such a big point, and immediately to my mind came The Hobbit, and like the reason why the Lord of the Rings happens is that Bilbo doesn't finish the story,
Yeah,
right?
true.
Frodo has to go and finish the story, take the ring, doesn't fly on the eagles, and
I That's perfectly fine. They would never have helped. Okay, that's
yes, I
different
know, I
different
know.
podcast.
Yeah, no, I know. Yeah, we should probably do that podcast at some point. But the cool thing about it is that somebody else had to finish the story because there were things that happened that were explained away and that made sense.
Yeah,
And those were events that informed who Bilbo was.
yeah.
But the fact that it was not finished allowed the DM, the
Hmm.
great Tolkien, to go and finish the story
Yeah.
and write this whole new chapter. And I think that's something that has merit, even though the analogy might have been a bit, unnecessary here. um,
No, I think it
but
makes
I love them.
sense. It's just between two characters in that case, but the
Yeah.
same works for a single character, right? It's just that, while for example, let's take Ida from Magnus's background,
Hmm.
right? Childhood love. They had split up, and essentially their story ended there, but their story meeting each other wasn't over. Their lives weren't
Yes.
over, and
Yeah.
when they collided again, of course, they were in very different places. And everything that happened before informed who they were now, because
Yeah.
even though their relationship ended and they didn't see each other again since then, they had unresolved feelings and they had all of this and all of that. Whereas if you had said she's dead, that's
Yeah.
it. That's the end of
Yeah.
that. He might carry some sadness over it, but it would not have been what it became later
Nearly
on.
as interesting. I agree. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think, I mean, those, as you mentioned along the way, those are also fine because they can inform
Yeah.
your character in certain ways. Like my character is angry over the death of this person,
Exactly.
so
But
they're pursuing this other person. But that
yeah.
always hinges on that other thing
Mm-hmm.
that is tied to it. While when you
Exactly.
leave a plot point open, your DM can jump
Mm-hmm.
in and pull that string and see what
Yeah,
happens.
exactly. And like closing certain things is good, because
Yeah.
things can kind of stories or experiences can close in the background and still be relevant now. But if you close everything, is kind of my point, because I've had players who have done a lot of work and an incredible job, and I praise them for it. But then I
Yeah.
actually got to using their backstory, and I was like, yeah, this was like 20
Can't
years
do much.
ago, and that's not here now, and I'm kind of just, I have nothing recent or
Yeah.
relevant. And
Yeah.
it's just such a shame, right? Because if you're going to put in that work, you want to
Yeah.
make sure that you get to see the fruits of your labor.
Yeah. Yeah. And I want to see it as your DM. I want to see
Yeah,
what happens
yeah,
and stuff. So yeah.
absolutely. So, we are almost perfectly on time. It's probably
Yes.
my inner German.
Yeah.
or Swiss, I
Rearing
guess.
its head.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like clockwork.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I think we covered, or we not covered, but talked about what we wanted to talk about.
Yes.
And yeah, like the last time, I could talk about this for another 2
Yeah.
hours, but at some point my throat is gonna go, so
Yeah.
probably
Yeah.
healthy to.
And at
talk
some
to
point,
it.
it just wouldn't make sense to anybody else because we just talk about characters that we've both played or seen in each other's games, and it would just evolve into this
Yeah, yeah.
self-aggrandizing situation where we just praise each other and
You know, my ego could use that, but in the meantime, I'm gonna say let's call it here.
Yes.
So to you, of course, thank you so much, and
Thank you as well.
no problem. And of course, to anyone who viewed or will be viewing this in the future, thank you so much. You can find us here on Twitch, twitch.tv/chaotic stupid media, and on our YouTube channel as well. All of the links are going to go up all around this place, so don't worry about finding anything. And most of all, if you guys want to talk to us, find us on Twitter. It's Chaotic Stupid Co. So it's just Chaotic Stupid, one word, and then CO at the end.
And tune in on Sunday.
Yes. Oh yeah, very good
happens.
point, because we are playing D&D on Sunday, D&D 5e. So Sunday at 5:30 PM CET, or if you are in EST, that is, I believe, 11:30 EST.
Yes.
Yeah, 11:30 AM. So hopefully we'll see you then or next time. But in any case, thank you so much for watching, listening, whatever you did, and we'll see you next time.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.